Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to see you today. Welcome to Trinity Church's Adult Forum here on Sunday morning. I am pleased today to be with fellow Trinitarian Dr. Laurie Hamilton as we talk about health and wellness in times of really trauma and disaster. And I know, Laurie, you agree with me that this COVID-19 situation that we are all living with really does end up being, for many of us, a situation that is a disaster. I was just listening to or reading this morning in the newspaper that this has already beginning to surpass the type of level of community disruption and even deaths percentage-wise as the 1918 flu pandemic. So this is certainly disruption, certainly national disaster, world disaster, and traumatic in many of our lives. So thank you for being with us today. Can you, let's start by you sharing with everyone a little bit about your own professional life and the work that you've done around health and wellness?
Sure. I'm actually finishing 45 years of clinical practice as a clinical psychologist. Although I started out with a background in nursing. I had taken nursing in college. And I got interested in trauma mitigation in the 80s, which is perhaps before some of the listeners were even shining on this side. But I got interested in trauma mitigation. And when we moved here to Asheville from Santa Monica in 1991, I started doing a lot of work with first responders, doing critical incident debriefings, training people to do critical incident debriefings. And around that time, the Red Cross decided they wanted to start having mental health as something available during a disaster. Up until then, they had just had health services, and the nurses and MDs who were volunteering would often find themselves doing a fair amount of counseling. So I got involved with that, and very quickly the Red Cross decided that they wanted to send me all around the country training mental health professionals to do that kind of response. Wow. So I've been doing, and then somewhere in there, I became the state lead for North Carolina in disaster mental health. And that encompassed 9/11, so wow. 2001. I had to step back from a lot of that active work once I started doing more caretaking for aging family members.
Of course.
So that's essentially what I've done disaster-wise. I've done a lot of training and a lot of mitigation.
Yeah,
and that,
as well as
that's reflected in the clinical work I do. I'm
right.
a trauma specialist.
Right.
So.
Well, that's a lot of experience in this this topic. So again, I want to thank you for being with us and sharing your insights and knowledge. So as we look at this COVID-19 situation, we know that it is, as I was saying, a traumatic situation for many of us. Our lives have been uprooted. Some of our jobs have been uprooted. Our home life has changed 100% for many of us. And even if we don't have children at home, our situations have changed drastically. And we think and pray specifically always for those who are in care facilities of some type, who are now isolated in deep isolation, and now for a very long time. So can you give us kind of an insight of what are some of the common issues that people face in these types of disasters or traumatic situations in life?
Right. So you've mention some of the special circumstances that we're dealing with. In all disasters, there is disruption. Some of it is expected. So I'm sure everyone has experienced a hurricane. Maybe they've experienced earthquakes, tornadoes, that sort of thing. Okay.
I felt the earthquake the other day.
Congratulations. So did Jack. I thought I simply was being unsteady on my feet.
It was pretty strong in my house.
It was quite strong. So, and in the disaster framework, we think of whatever the incident that took place. If you picture like a map or a sailing chart, okay, it could be an island, right? And then there's the impact that thing has around your incident.
Right.
What we're finding over and over again is that what we call the psychological footprint, which is the longer lasting effects of the thing, are far greater than whatever we initially consider.
Yeah.
Okay. In this situation, we've gotten a trifecta of disaster.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm not saying that like I'm really excited about it. It alarms me because we have the physical threat, the disease threat. We have the second physical threat, which is our economic stability, which actually for a large number of people, that's the worst part of the disaster. The threat of the illness is less threat. So we have the economic. We also then have, as you say, it's the disruption, but it's the continuing disruption.
Yeah.
Everyone in the early quarantine was sort of saying, well, we've got this for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and sort of enforced vacation, and people got out their old board games, literally bored, but they became bored with the board games, and and it's like, we got to be doing something different. We have to open up and chomping at the bit, because if it's a tornado or if it's a hurricane, the threat passes, and then we go into recovery. Well, we're nowhere near doing recovery now, unfortunately.
Right.
We're still in the thick of it. And so how it looks compared to, say, other disasters, much more similar to a world war, where people were in it for years.
Yeah.
Much more similar. I mean, ask a person who's had a stroke, which is the brain's equivalent of a tornado. Ask the person who's had a stroke what the period of recovery is.
Yeah.
All right. And all of a sudden, our sense of what this is, how this is impacting us, really changes. Now, most people are used to dealing with, I would say, trauma on an individual or a family level. So the family that has a young parent die, the family that has, God forbid, a child die, that is something that reverberates decades,
for a long time,
the entire family's life.
Yeah.
Right. So when we're looking at this, I do go back to some of what our physiological responses are, when we get bad news, when we hear a scary thing, when we experience a scary thing, when you're driving on I-26, this happens all the time. We have a physiological reaction. It's hardwired. We have fight, flight, or freeze, and we can cycle through all these things. They normally occur, okay? It's just hard when they're occurring when we don't want them to. It's okay to get all geared up if you're having a good time
Right.
and you're at the amusement park and you're, remember those days, screaming as you go down the roller coaster, but you believe that the roller coaster will keep you safe.
Right.
So it isn't abject fear, all right? When you think that you could go hurtling off into space, it's abject fear and it's not fun at all.
No,
right?
no.
Freeze response is very similar. We literally stop. Our blood pressure drops. Okay, we're frozen. We need somebody to tell us what to do usually. Okay, and our mind can be quite sluggish.
Yeah.
It can be very unpleasant.
Yeah.
The upside of it, though, interestingly enough, is if we believe we're safe, that is actually a physical state that leads to genuine spiritual experience. So a lot of people in horrible situations will have pretty profound experience. You've heard it referred to as God on the battlefield. Okay,
Right.
somebody feels that they are safe, they are being protected. These physiological responses, so they do have an upside, okay, and they clearly have a downside. They become part of our emotional pattern for response. So someone who's more in a fight mode is going to try to control a situation. Somebody who is in flight mode is going to try to get away from it, withdraw. Right. And somebody who is in freeze mode is going to comply.
Yeah.
Right. So,
yeah.
You know, and it works if people are trusting kind of what they're being told to do. It works in fight mode if you trust the information you're getting about who and what you should be fighting and how.
Yeah.
Okay. And we cycle through these. So after a moment of pausing, you can go into control mode. All right, I am going to organize all this. I am going to contact all the family members. I'm going to set up this calendar. You know, I'm going to control this.
Yeah. I think, don't you think I have seen all of this. I mean, yes. I think I've experienced all of these moments in this COVID-19, and I think that I have observed it in many of my friends and family and those that I know. So I'm intrigued by your pointing out, because of course I had not thought of that we have like this trifecta here of the physical danger, the economic danger, and what was the third one you said? I can't.
It's the ongoingness
of
time,
this, and
which is very disruptive. Yeah,
it is. And I was also intrigued by you pointing out how different people are affected more by one or the other of these, which explains why this is, seems to me why this has been so hard for us to deal with as younger people experience the physical threat as a lot lower, right, and the economic threat as a lot higher, not exclusively, but at one level, of course, which is it seems to me one of the reasons why so much of the new cases are coming from bars and social gatherings of younger folks.
Of course.
Because the physical, they perceive the physical threat to be so much less, and yet we're a society, we're a whole group, right? So when those cases continue to hang around, they hang around for everybody. So that's just I think an important distinction that you point out that helps me kind of frame where we are, what's going on with us as a people, right, what's going on with us as a society, right, and explain a little bit about why this is kind of still with us, because we, unlike, maybe this is not fair. I mean, I don't have any recollection personally of a world war, but unlike a world war where there seems to be a collective one threat that the whole society can get around and get their mind around.
Well, you raise a very good point, because one of our coping, well, humans, unlike the rest of, well, I shouldn't say unlike the rest of the animal kingdom, because we're finding out that a lot of species have much more refined communication than we ever gave them credit for.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we are collectively seeing a number of species who are quite threatened because of global, the climate changes and such, and they are communicating that. I don't know if they have a framework for understanding what's happening to them.
Mm-hmm.
Humans struggle to have the framework to understand why this is occurring. And pointing out that when we have a common enemy, that is actually an organizing force.
Mm.
One of the things we're seeing here, and to some degree in some other countries, not universally, is that there is disagreement about who the common enemy is.
Mm-hmm.
And so that leads to a real divisiveness.
Yeah.
In a country like Switzerland, okay, which has had very little polarization, they are having, same as we, they're having physical threat, economic threat, and disruption.
Yeah.
So that hasn't changed. But they regard it as coming from one source, and whatever they're saying should be complied with, people are complying.
Yeah.
Here we've got different attitudes, and this is leading to much, well, blame is actually a great coping strategy. If you can blame the enemy, if you can say, the house burned down because this jerk was smoking a cigarette in bed, right? We've got our target of who we're really angry at.
Mm-hmm.
But and that gives you a sense of control. All right. If I know who's at fault, well, I don't. What are those jokes? Be like Bill, or don't do what Don does. I mean, don't be like that guy, right? And it gives me a sense of control.
So a sense of control is a coping mechanism in
absolutely.
Trauma, and blame is also very common in trauma and disaster. And it's one thing when we can all blame hurricane, down east, the big conversation still is Floyd, Hurricane Floyd,
sure.
That's the common enemy, or Germany's the common enemy, or whatever it might be. But this is a real challenge. For some reason, illness is, and it's kind of it's a not very well known illness. I read the other day, they only now have a greater level of confidence scientifically about the spread through aerosol, and so it's really just interesting to see how human beings cope with trauma and cope with disaster, and how this incident specifically is so hard to fit into the common scheme of how we as a society and as a group of people kind of cope well, maybe perhaps
Right.
with trauma.
Well, it is very, I think the word novel gets used a lot.
Right.
Although, and you making references to how do people cope with these kinds of changes.
Yeah.
That
Tell us about that.
we are a historical people. Okay, we have a lot of examples of how people have dealt with things in different times. Kids are going back to school now, but school is looking really different. And
Oh boy.
there was a description.
And many aren't going back. I mean,
Oh, sure. There was a description of what recess might look like with people standing out, socially distancing, and how ridiculous that would be. And I always think when I'm hearing people talk, and I was thinking, well, gosh, that's where we got some of our playground games. Ring Around the Rosie is all about smallpox. London Bridge is Falling Down is all about the catastrophic London fire that talk about a disaster that affected generations. Okay. So when I look at that, I say, oh, so play is a really instinctual human response. All right. We crave play. Lots of examples of craving social connection.
yeah.
Lots of examples of searching for meaning, for illumination, for entertainment. Okay, all these things, it's kind of hardwired into us.
Yeah.
We're built for this.
Yeah.
And we have examples of people doing things in our past. I at various times when I've had rough spots in my life, I've called on, I think my internal image is I had a great grandmother who was born in a covered wagon crossing the plains. And as I grew older and became a mom, I realized that meant that her mother gave birth in a covered wagon.
Right.
And it's like, I've never done that.
Right.
That's like really beyond what I think I'm capable of.
Mm-hmm.
But clearly that's something that's passed down in my genes.
Yeah.
Okay.
When you were just talking a moment ago, I have every priest has to be careful about stories about their children that they use, but nevertheless, let me just say that one of my children did have an orientation session at their school this week, and just an hour and a half. And when I picked them up, I asked how it went, and the response was, okay. And when I asked more, he said, Dad, they're going to make us stay 6 feet apart for everything. And I said, yeah, they are. And he looked at me with all seriousness and said, what's the point? And I said, well, what do you mean? Like, what's the point of even going? Yeah, like, what's the point? What would we do even outside? And I'm sure we won't even be able to play basketball. So what's the point? And you could just hear almost the trauma for this 13-year-old.
Or the helplessness.
And helplessness,
right?
Yeah.
And how can I get what I need?
Right.
Right. And I think this is why I was mentioning that the built-in resilience that we do have, but sometimes it takes us a little while to organize so we can access that.
Yeah, let's look at that for a minute. Resilience. What does that look like?
Well, resilience, if you want to call it the carry-on spirit, that you've seen that poster everywhere, the keep calm and carry on.
Carry
I mean,
on.
we probably need a COVID equivalent of it. But what is carry on? So if your son is disheartened about not being able to play at recess, I mean, there are quite a few different pieces there, okay? Because his point about what's the point is, first off, exactly correct. Because if they just stand there like little statues, then why in heaven's name are they going outside to do that? That's rather silly, right? But how about that inborn desire for play and entertainment? And I can kind of picture what I saw in my head thinking about that was that some version of a Marco Polo with a hacky sack, except that you couldn't be transferring the hacky sack between players, but there would be some way that each of them would have their own hacky sack, and there would be a way that somebody became it, and whatever, which will be our 21st century equivalent of Ring Around the Rosie. And it will be a playground game that developed because of needing to social distance.
Well, as we speak for a moment about resilience, I do want to mention a couple of things that I've learned recently, and especially for us as a church community. We'll have time in our next session to look a little bit more deeply at this type of thing, but some research that's recently been done about church life and faith life and trauma shows that a question was posed to people that if a church in their area helped when you experience trauma, how likely would you be to seek that help from a church? And it's like 90% of people who consider themselves Christian. It's like 80% of people who consider themselves Christian but really have not participated in any aspect of Christian community or worship or anything in their lives. And it's nearly 50% of people who consider themselves not Christian. So I think what is really kind of powerful for us as a church community is to know that in a situation like this, we are being called to be present and to have a presence, to still be welcoming, whether it's virtually or online or whatever way we can. And it makes me think of a passage in the scripture that we're going to hear more about here at Trinity in the months ahead. But this one from Hebrews, very simple passage that just says, we have this hope, an anchor in the soul. And this image of God being an anchor in life, I think, is one that is an image of resiliency, you might say.
Right.
That in the midst of this storm, in the midst of this disaster, we do have a faith that doesn't change in one aspect. That the fundamentals does not change, and that is the presence and love and care of God, who guides us and loves us in all things, and walks with us in the most difficult times of life.
Right. Mr. Rogers.
Yes, one of my heroes.
Blessed man. Because he did a number of shows talking with people who are dealing with difficult situations.
Yeah.
And one of his phrases, which I think is beautiful, is look for the helpers.
Right.
Okay. So I'd like to reframe that a little bit, though, for this purpose, because we can be the helpers, but help is all sorts of different things. So help isn't just going and visiting someone who's isolated, although that's very helpful. Help can be the one who thinks of the playground game. Help can be someone who comes up with a really funny joke. Trust me, laughing is really helpful for resilience.
Yeah, it's a coping.
And most people are familiar with what we call black humor or gallows humor.
Right.
That helpers in the health profession and first responders, trust me, lots of gallows humor.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
They know it.
But that all of these things are part of what we bring to the table. And in my mind, a really, really strong what God does in our lives is that he makes all of this available. He doesn't give us access just to, this is an old phrase, but poopy pious words. Right. He doesn't just do that. Okay. But I've seen the Spirit working in what you and David are doing. I mean, first off, you both have a very, very good track record of wonderful sermons. Okay.
Well,
but you guys have really been sparkling. I mean, and some of the humor, I still to this day, I had to leave the room when you talked about your dog eating your dough. I had to leave, okay, because it was so funny. It was like stand-up comedian in church. That's the Holy Spirit, Scott. That's part of our resilience.
Well, Dr. Hamilton, I am, this is really the great, valuable conversation, and I'm so thankful for our time this morning. And I'm looking forward to next week when we're going to look at a couple of other aspects of this conversation, along with how a little bit more detail on the resiliency than the tools that parents are deeply in need of at this time, and the ways that our own Trinity Church community is seeking to respond at this time, the ways in which we as a faith community can lean on each other and support each other at this time. So I am looking forward to that conversation next week. So thank you everyone for being with us this morning, and I hope you'll take a moment to send me any questions you might have. So send them to me at the church, scott@trinityasheville.org. You can call me, 253-9361. Any method that works for you. Send me your questions about health and wellness at this time, questions about specific questions that you'd like to have addressed, or ideas or images that come to you in this time, or scripture passages that you have found to be a blessing and a comfort at this time. So thank you, everyone, and we will see you next week.